In the 1930s, across the Great Plains, from the Texas Panhandle north to the Dakotas, farm families woke to ordinary mornings, the winter wheat in the ground and the wind quiet. They had no way of knowing that within a few hours, on the worst days, the sky itself would turn black at noon. On the southern high plains, spring of 1935 brought a sky that turned black at noon. In Elkhart, Kansas, the wall of dust rose 5 miles away, a rolling tide of dirt that swallowed the horizon. Main Street emptied as the cloud advanced, storefronts, a lone car, all waiting for the grit to hit. At Boise City, Oklahoma, the same storm erased the line between earth and air. In Cimarron County, a farmer and his 2 sons walked bent into the dust, heads down, eyes squinted against the stinging soil. They wore caps and coats to shield themselves, but the dust found every crack. Across the panhandles, Amarillo and Lubbock, Texas, saw the same. Black clouds rolled in, turning day to night, covering fields and homes in a fine, suffocating silt. Yet they kept farming. The land had been plowed too deep, the drought too long. After the storm passed, they swept the dirt from their homes, planted again, hoped for rain. The dust came back, season after season, until the government paid them to plant grass. But in those years, they watched the sky turn black at noon, and then kept on. The storms rolled north. In Ramsey County, North Dakota, a wall of dirt blotted out the sun at midday. Farm families huddled in rooms sealed with wet cloths, but the dust sifted through every crack. Near Williston, the same. After a storm, a farmer surveyed his buried fields. The soil that had taken generations to build now drifted against fence lines like snow. He stood in the ruin of Sudan grass, the crop that was supposed to hold the earth. Mr. Bosley of the reorganization unit walked that field and knew the land was breaking apart and no one could stop it. Colorado suffered too. In Baca County, a dust storm erased the horizon. The sky turned black at noon. After the dust settled, women swept dirt from beds and dishes while children coughed through bandanas. The aftermath, a lone tree stripped of leaves, a barn half submerged in silt. In Prowers County, another storm scoured the land. Neighbors helped neighbors, digging out animals, patching roofs. But the topsoil was gone, and with it, any hope of a harvest that year. And then there was April 14th, 1935, Black Sunday in Baca County. The storm came without warning. Families ran for root cellars. Those caught outside tied handkerchiefs over their faces and stumbled blind towards any shelter. When it passed, the land looked like a different planet. Drifts covered roads. Cars sat buried. The people who stayed knew they were fighting a war against the sky. And every year, the sky won a little more. In Cimarron County, Oklahoma, sand dunes climbed over the orchard. The trees stood half buried, their branches reaching up like drowned men's arms. A farmer raised his fence, plank by plank, to keep it from being swallowed by drifting sand. Buried farm implements, plows, harrows, lay rusting under the dunes, their steel surfaces scoured by grit. The wind had turned the land against itself. Entire farms became uninhabitable. A Dust Bowl farmer's fence posts disappeared into the rising tide of soil. Near St. Anthony, North Dakota, trees were stripped bare by drought and grasshoppers. The insects came in clouds, eating every leaf, every shred of green. In Grant County, the dead trees framed the farmhouse like a gallows. A tractor plowed near an abandoned and wrecked tenant house in Wagoner County, Oklahoma. The tenant had gone, leaving the place to the dust. The A.O. Ryland family of Williston had quit farming for the present. They sat on their porch, faces slack, not looking at the camera. The sandhills northeast of Scottsbluff, Nebraska, were dotted with abandoned farms and homes. Families had pulled out, leaving their houses to the wind. In Oklahoma, an abandoned farm stood with its roof caved in, a collapsed barn behind it. The cost was measured not in dollars, but in buried machinery, dead trees, and land that had become uninhabitable. These were not dramatic disasters, just slow erosion. A tractor could still run if you could get it out of the sand, but there was no money to fix it, and no rain. Some families simply left. Buried farm machinery in Cimarron County, Oklahoma. Tractors and plows swallowed by sand, their iron skeletons rusting under a sky that stayed brown. Sand dunes climbed over fences and crept into barns. A windmill and tank stood idle on an abandoned farm, blades frozen, the well likely dry. The land had turned against them. They loaded what they could onto trucks and headed west, not knowing if they'd ever return. But others stayed. Near Guymon, Oklahoma, men worked to clear drifts of soil from the highways, shoveling the topsoil of their neighbors' farms onto trucks, moving it aside so that the road could still be traveled. An abandoned farm in Cimarron County sat empty, its house weathered and windows dark. Further south, near Dalhart, Texas, another abandoned farm in the Coldwater district. A ghost of a homestead, the door hanging open. Sand drifted along a fence line north of Dalhart, burying the barbed wire. The wind had no mercy, and those who stayed fought back. A Dust Bowl farm in the Coldwater district near Dalhart, still occupied. They furrowed against the wind, ploughing deep trenches perpendicular to the prevailing gusts to check the drift of sand. It was brutal work. Day after day, they watched the sky turn black at noon. They lost crops, livestock, and neighbors. But they kept farming. They kept farming because the land was all they had, and leaving meant admitting defeat. And so they stayed, and they endured. In Williams County, North Dakota, the Munger family stood outside their frame house, the sky a pale, dusty white. They were among the Scandinavian and German homesteaders who stayed, watching their wheat wither in the drought-stricken fields. The wind carried the soil away, but they kept farming, season after season, their hands calloused and faces lined. The children of the Hall family, near Alamo, North Dakota, played among the sparse grass, their clothes worn and faded. Their parents, like the Hurovich family and the Forders, had mortgaged their futures to the land. The FSA photographer found them in unpainted shacks, like the one housing Joe Kramer near Williston, a shack of boards and tar paper where a family of 6 lived. Olaf Fugelberg, a farmer near Williston, moved his family into the basement of an unfinished house. It was cooler and more protected. His daughter, like the daughter of the Shotbang family, grew up knowing the constant grit of dust between her teeth. The Herman Gerling family, near Wheelock, coped with a daughter who had lost an arm. They kept farming. The FSA photographs captured all of them. The Nels Berkelans, the Walter Muras, the Floyd Peaches families, each staying, shaping their lives from the stubborn soil. Out on the southern plains, families dug in. In Shawnee County, Kansas, a tenant farmer's family stood beside their house, the wood weathered silver by sun and grit. Farther west, Mrs. Schoenfeld, wife of an FSA client in Sheridan County, carried buckets from the well, the pump handle worn smooth. In Labette County, the Mish family, tenant purchase borrowers, posed on their front steps, faces lean but unbroken. They kept farming because there was nothing else to do. The women held the households together. In Muskogee County, a sharecropper's wife stood at the kitchen table, kneading dough with hands that knew no rest. Near Warner, Oklahoma, a tenant farmer's wife froze ice cream on her porch, the hand-crank churn a small luxury against the heat. Another wife, child on her hip, looked out past the yard to fields that gave little. In Oklahoma City, a carpenter's wife sat on the steps of a community camp shack, her baby in her lap, the thin walls no barrier against the dust. They watched the sky turn black at noon. Then they kept farming. It was not heroism, it was habit. The wind stripped the topsoil, and they planted again. Dust sifted through every crack, into flour sacks, into lungs. But the land was all they knew. So they stayed. On the Baque farm near Ambrose, North Dakota, the house stood weathered and low against the horizon. A tool shed leaned beside it near Truax, its boards warped by sun and wind. Out in Williams County, a cluster of buildings seemed to huddle together, roofs pitched against the constant southern gales. These were not grand structures, they were shelters, raised by hands that knew the plains could turn hostile without warning. In Ottawa County, Oklahoma, a zinc miner's home sat exposed, its wood frame barely holding against the drifts. A miner's shack near Pitcher stood on blocks, the yard empty but for an old bed frame. The farmers who stayed learned to improvise. One man in Cimarron County ripped the roof off his own barn to build a windbreak for his garden. A tangle of lath and wire served as a screen, while sand piled up against an outhouse door. Dust piled high around a farmhouse in Oklahoma, burying fence posts and creeping up the walls. Near Olustee, a vacant farmhouse stood abandoned, its windows dark, the fields around it given over to mechanization and drought. In Cimarron County, an adobe farmhouse, built by a rehabilitation client, remained intact, its thick walls a lesson from earlier times. A sign in Pinal County, Arizona, spelled out the name Dust Bowl, a word that carried for those who left. The sand kept moving, the homes stayed. On the Arkansas River bottom, a tractor hauled a trailer loaded with oil drums. The farmer, his face lined with dust, worked the dry ground, turning up pale clouds that hung in the still air. Where wheat and alfalfa once grew, only stubble and cracks remained. A native Texan farmer, tractored out, now worked on relief in Goodley, Hardeman County. His home was a canvas tent rigged beside the field. Herman Gerling filled barrels from a spring, water for stock and home. His tractor sat idle beside the machine shed on his drought-stricken farm in Williams County, North Dakota. A discarded binder rusted in the grass. The land had given up. In the sandhills of Nebraska, Dr. C.R. Watson's Hereford cattle followed a worn path to a windmill waterhole. The cows stood thin-ribbed, their hides dusty, waiting. Work continued despite the failing yields. Men gathered beans from dry sandland northeast of Scottsbluff, Nebraska, each pod tiny, the crop poor. Cattle concentrated around windmills and waterholes on the grazing land between Mitchell and the sandhills. A path worn deep by hooves cut across the sparse grass. The waterhole shrank under a relentless sun. Every acre yielded less than the season before, but they kept farming. They had no other way. Here in the Nebraska sandhills, the windmill was the heart of the operation. Days went by hauling water for the herd, walking behind the horse-drawn wagon with barrels sloshing. The Herefords, white-faced and steady, gathered around the wooden tank, their breath clouding in the cool morning air. The windmill creaked and whirled, pulling up what little moisture the deep earth still held. When it failed, they drove miles to a creek or a neighbor's well, a chore that could take half a day. On the southern plains, a family, German-Russian homesteaders, turned the soil with a new tractor bought through an FSA loan. The father sat high in the metal seat, his young son wedged beside him, gripping the fender. The tractor kicked up a plume of dust that hung in the still air. Behind them, the dry earth rolled away, waiting for a crop that might never come. The boy's face was shaded by a worn cap, his eyes squinting against the glare of the sun and the grit. But on the 4th of July in Vail, Oregon, the dust was forgotten for an afternoon. A baseball game brought the community together. Players in baggy flannel trousers, a crowd of families on the grass. The announcer's voice crackled over a loudspeaker. Someone had hauled water for the players from a creek miles away. Children ran along the foul line, chasing a foul ball. For a few hours, the sky was just sky, and the game was all that mattered. Inside the cavernous Oklahoma City warehouse, new tractors stood in long rows, their steel wheels still caked with red dirt from the factory yard. Farmers from Cimarron County to the Texas Panhandle came here to trade worn-out horses for iron horsepower. The tread marks on the concrete floor told the story. Dozens had already driven their purchases straight out onto the highway, heading home before the next dust storm. On wooden shelves near the back, plow points were stacked hundreds deep. Cast iron tips meant to cut the hardpan that had formed after years of drought. A farmer from Greer County tested the weight of one in his palm, running a thumb along its edge. The warehouse keeper watched silently, knowing many of these points would snap within a month on the baked earth. Beyond the parts counter, harrow discs and cultivator shovels filled bins that reached to the rafters. A young man in a patched shirt sorted through a pile of bolts, matching threads by hand. The air smelled of grease and old wood. Outside, another farmer drove his new tractor into the afternoon sun, black smoke curling from the exhaust, leaving the warehouse quiet, its stock already shrinking toward another season. In Minnesota, a homemaker in a tidy new kitchen slid glass jars into a copper bath, the steam fogging the windows. She was canning vegetables as insurance against next year's dust. the cellar below held rows of quart jars, green beans, tomatoes, corn, each seal a promise that even if the sky went black again, the family would eat. Down in Texas, the communal cannery hummed with compressed steam vats, massive silver cylinders where vegetables cooked under pressure. Half the workers were women, their hands quick with hot jars. In Dania, Florida, a vegetable packing shed saw crates of carrots and celery move from field to railcar, iced for the long trip north. The market in San Antonio weighed bushels of peppers and squash under a tin roof. Cold storage lockers in town allowed farmers to keep meat and vegetables frozen through the lean months. But home canning slowly faded, edged out by cheaper factory cans and convenience. A roadside vegetable stand in Porterville, California, still offered tomatoes and squash in bushel baskets, but fewer women boiled their own jars. The knowledge passed to silence, replaced by grocery shelves. In Williston, North Dakota, farmers filled the county commissioner's meeting room. Men in worn overalls and felt hats stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces set with grim purpose. They had come to protest. Not just the dust, but the system that let them starve while grain rotted in elevators. The Union Hall became a second home. There, neighbors who had competed for rain now shared strategies, pooled horses, and signed petitions together. It was the only way to hold on. In Muskogee, Oklahoma, the tenant farmers' union gathered under a shade tree. Men squatted on their heels, passing a jug of water, talking low. These were the ones who owned nothing but the clothes on their backs, yet they pooled dimes for a lawyer to fight eviction notices. At dusk, they scattered, each heading back to a farm that might not be theirs by spring. But for that afternoon, they were a community, not a collection of failures. Joe Kramer's farm near Williston told the story plainly. A bare yard, a windmill that creaked in the constant wind, a wife who waved from the kitchen door. In Williams County, a stone building stood solid against the drifting soil, its roof patched with tar paper. In town, a farmer from Beach, North Dakota, leaned against a storefront, his eyes on the empty street. In Frederick, Oklahoma, another farmer shuffled into the feed store for a sack of cottonseed cake. Each one had learned you couldn't farm alone. You leaned on your neighbor or you blew away. Near Liberal, Kansas, farmers fought the dust directly. They chiseled deep furrows into the earth, leaving fields rough and ridged to catch the blowing soil. Ditches filled rapidly with silt. The land itself seemed to swallow the work. One farmer listed his fields under the wind erosion control program, dragging a narrow chisel plow behind a team of horses, darkness spreading across the sky at midday. At the Ropesville rural community in Texas, a resettled farmer terraced his 120-acre farm step by step, shaping gentle ridges across the slope to slow the wind. Near Pie Town, Mr. Leatherman, a homesteader from Texas, built terraces with his burro. The patient animal hauled soil while he fashioned check dams and diversion ditches. Terracing fell out of fashion after the war, edged out by irrigation and larger machinery that reshaped the land faster, though not always smarter. Contour farming and wind erosion fences offered another defense. In Michigan, farmers built fences from brush and branches, placed in the direction of prevailing winds to trap drifting soil. Near Liberal, Kansas, leveling machines smoothed hummocks and filled ditches, but the wind still buried abandoned farms in Idaho, covering stone foundations with sand. Contour work and brush fences persisted only where families had time and muscle to maintain them. Once government support faded, so did the fences. Tenant farmer near Warner, Oklahoma, stood beside his mailbox near Hydro, the wood weathered and his name all but erased by wind. The corn had dried up and lay in the field, stalks bent like old men. Between Tulare and Fresno, two families from Independence, Kansas, had stopped their truck on the roadside, their faces shadowed. They hauled water from distant wells daily. The sky had turned black at noon, but they kept farming because there was nothing else to do. In Pitcher, Oklahoma, the zinc mine and smelter kept men employed even as the land died. A zinc smelter worker stood by the furnaces, his face grimed with ore dust. The blowing dust in the Oklahoma Panhandle crept into every crevice. One of the pioneer women of the Panhandle Dust Bowl leaned against a fence, her apron wind-whipped. They fought the drought with irrigation in Cimarron County, ditches cut across the hardpan, but the water came slow. Cotton farmers near Oil City, Oklahoma, gathered as day laborers in Carter County, their wages thin. In town at Eufaula, they talked, leaning against dusty fenders. The corn, dried up and lying in the field, told the story. They had watched the sky turn black at noon. Then they kept farming, because a farmer does not know how to stop. In Cimarron County, a garden lay buried under advancing sand, an orchard smothered by the same relentless drift. But some farmers refused to surrender. They chiseled the soil into contour ridges that caught the wind. They built terraces to hold the rain. A plough that once broke the prairie now sat half swallowed by sand in a corner of a field, a reminder of what had been lost. Yet even as cows sought shelter in town and chickens huddled from stinging grit, those who stayed began the slow work of coaxing life back into the land. In Boise City, a dusting plane dipped low over a bean field, trailing a cloud of insecticide, one of the new tools against crop failure. But the deeper solution was simpler: irrigation. A farmer pumped water from below, coaxing green shoots from dry earth. The worst blow, they said, was behind them. Terraces and contour ploughing held the topsoil. Windbreaks of young trees began to rise. Slowly, stubbornly, the plains came back. The land that had turned to dust bore scars, a field blown bare to the subsoil, a stock watering hole nearly filled with shifting topsoil. Yet those who stayed learned to read the sky. They watched the sun rise through the haze and knew when to shelter the stock, when to lay down the plough. The terraces they built held, the windbreaks grew. In the long afternoon light, they saw the black dust settle and the first faint green of grass returning. In the northern plains, a sleeping child lay in a farm home in Williams County, North Dakota. The house still stood, the roof still held, and through the windows the sky still turned black at noon. But the family remained, anchored to the land by habit, by hope, by the simple fact that they had nowhere else to go. Farther south, near Olustee, Oklahoma, a vacant farmhouse stood as testament to what had been lost. Mechanization and drought had pressed families off the land. But here and there, a home still sheltered its people. They kept farming because farming was all they knew, because the land was theirs, because quitting meant losing everything. They watched the sky turn black at noon. Then they kept farming. The dust storms came and went, but the land endured, and so did they. Soil blew away, crops failed, but the houses still stood, and in them life continued. Quiet, stubborn, unchanged. The rains came back. The soil, chiseled and terraced and held down by the families who stayed, came back with them. If your own people lived through the dust years, tell their story in the comments and subscribe, so the memory of what they endured isn't lost.